Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 113th episode. Today, we will connect with Washington, D.C. to have a chat with the World Bank's Chief Economist for South Asia, Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge. In her role, Franziska is responsible for leading the research program on key economic issues in South Asia to inform the policy debate and World Bank lending. Before this, she was the manager at the Development Economics Vice Presidency, where she spearheaded the flagship Global Economic Prospects report for the World Bank. Prior to joining the bank, Franziska worked in the Office of the Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and at the International Monetary Fund, where I had the pleasure of being her colleague. Franziska Ohnsorge, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Real joy. Thank you.
Great to have you. Let's start with the basic general outlook for South Asian economies in 2024, Franziska.
Yeah, actually, South Asia is an interesting region because it's the bright spot in the global economy. South Asia as a whole is going to be the fastest growing region of all the World Bank's 5 emerging market and developing economy regions. And that's thanks to India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives. They're all going to grow more than 4.5%, which is the growth rate of East Asia and Pacific by our forecasts. But there are 2 exceptions, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. They're clearly an outlier in that bright spot story. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. But also for India compared to other emerging markets, but for themselves, by their own standards, they're going to slow. That growth represents a slowdown both from last year and from pre-pandemic averages. And in Bangladesh, that is in part because of balance of payment pressures that we assume are going to continue.
And in the case of India, which you said is the brightest spot among the large emerging market economies, what are the drivers of that marginal slowdown in growth in 2024?
So it's essentially a slowdown in investment growth for both countries. Actually, India and Bangladesh really stand out in the region as being the ones where growth is driven by government, very heavily driven by government. For both countries, you see a steep slowdown in private investment growth compared to the pre-pandemic average. And the public investment growth has been well above emerging market and developing economy averages. And that, of course, then raises the question, how long can that be sustained? With the fiscal challenges, I'm sure we'll come back to. But for both of them, that's a question, how long can growth be so heavily driven by governments?
Franziska, this really sort of puzzles me to some extent, especially your point about private investment, because with respect to India, headlines are all about this is India's century, this is India's moment to shine, its pocket of geopolitical advantage. And we hear about companies from the West, companies from other parts of Asia investing in Indian manufacturing. But then when I see the FDI number, it's the same number for the last decade as a share of GDP, 1.5% of GDP, 2% of GDP. In dollar terms, used to be 30, 40 billion, now it's 50, 60. But the nominal GDP has expanded so much that a share of GDP, India's FDI story doesn't look interesting or different at all from past trend. You have any view on that issue?
Yeah, I guess it takes a lot more than a government campaign to raise foreign direct investment and private investments, not just foreign direct investment. It's domestic private investment too. I mean, whatever restricts domestic private investment is also going to discourage foreign investors. And that's the whole business environment. So we haven't done any particular analysis to pinpoint what is the biggest culprit. But there are many things that come to mind. The restrictions on land, it's very difficult to buy and sell land. Heavy restrictions on labor, especially for the bigger companies that would be the ones attracting FDI. It's not easy. It's not easy to integrate into the global economy. That whole region, actually, and that is something we show, has import restrictions that go well above the emerging market and developing economy average. Import and export tradition, old-fashioned import and export restrictions in this region are way more than elsewhere. That goes back to Bangladesh as well as Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Very heavy use of foreign exchange restrictions. These are exactly the kinds of things that will discourage domestic investment and they discourage foreign investment.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the three countries in South Asia which now have IMF-supported programs. Of course, when we say IMF-supported programs, we also mean that the World Bank plays an integral role in these programs as well, so namely Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. You mentioned earlier that in the case of Bangladesh, clearly, it's a balance of payments issue. But just maybe characterize all three sequentially for us, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan.
Yeah. All of them have balance of payment issues, but Bangladesh is the one that's still growing. It's actually growing remarkably well, given the pressures. No? We are expecting 5.5% to 6%, no, in that range. That's the growth we're expecting for this year, the coming year, and the year after. That is a slowdown. And we expect these foreign exchange restrictions to continue despite the staff level agreement on the first review last month, and despite the increase in monetary policy rates last month. Import restrictions, we expect them to continue at least until early next year, into next year. And the foreign exchange pressures that seem to be not easing are also expected to continue. So the reserve data, the latest published reserve data is from October. It shows a relentless decline. Yep. Exchange rates depreciating. So clearly there is an underlying pressure that's just not going away despite these policy actions in October. And there is maybe things will change dramatically next year, but for now our assumption is that they're not changing dramatically next year. And of course you see that where you expect to see it, no? Private investment growth. Private investment growth is now 1.5% compared to what it used to be before the pandemic, 9% per year. It's really a dramatic difference. So really what's propping up growth for now is the government. It's government investment, heavy use of government investment and consumption too.
Right.
That's Bangladesh.
That's right.
Yeah. Pakistan, Sri Lanka. The story there is different. So they're obviously not the bright spot in the global economy. They're really the exception to that regional narrative. For both of them, we expect growth just below 2% next year and just above 2% the year after. And for both of them, that's a far cry from what it used to be, 4 to 5% before the pandemic. So it's really a completely different ballgame. But at least it's an end to the recessions. And the reason it's an end to the recessions is not because of this fantastic new wave of strength. It's because of all these adverse shocks from last year that are receding. That's what's driving the recovery. So for both of them, that's heavy use of import and foreign exchange restrictions that have now been unwound recently. So that's going to help growth a bit along. For Pakistan, it's obviously the floods, the recovery from the floods, that's going to help growth along. For Sri Lanka, the equivalent would be the recovery in tourism that seems to be underway. And the return of remittances also, at least through the documented channels, which kind of had really receded last year. So it's less of really strong growth, it's more adverse shocks, negative shocks, just subsiding finally, and that's giving the recovery.
If I may touch on that issue about remittances. So I read this in the context of Bangladesh, and I've also read this in the context of Pakistan, that the authorities always are very keen to get the remittances through the formal channel, and they think that it coming through the informal channel somehow undermines monetary policy or exchange rate controls. Tell me if I'm being naive. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter if the money comes in through the formal or the informal channel, as long as it comes in, because it creates a claim on domestic currency because there's a counterpart foreign currency that is being transferred. Am I getting something wrong here? Do we want to force all the remittances to come through the formal channel, or does it really not matter?
Well, I guess it would make a difference to financial intermediation, or the reserve, the foreign currency position of banks. If it goes through formal channels, you'll see it in some bank balance sheet, either the central banks or the commercial banks. And I guess that makes it easier then to manage the formal exchange rate, the official exchange rate. But in some sense, for growth, you're right, it shouldn't make much difference. As long as the households get the money, they'll spend it. What you do see across the region that I didn't see in Europe and Central Asia when I was working there, not to the same extent, is the tilt in the whole economy towards a certain structure. It's almost like there's a remittance economy. You see high consumption growth. You see high real estate growth. You see weak export growth. You see all the hallmarks of overvaluation. It's almost like Dutch disease based on remittances. So you see that across the region, there are many countries that rely very heavily on remittances, and you see these pressures in a lot of them. That's actually very noticeable in South Asia.
Indeed.
I want to make one more point on Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So in a way, I'm telling a good story that bad things are over. That bad shocks are receding. But even that recovery that we're projecting, that is a knife-edge recovery. Because the policy buffers are really wafer thin. Both countries still have to finance fiscal deficits on the order of 7% of GDP or more. Both countries are still going to spend more than half their revenues on interest payments. Both countries have reserves, foreign reserves, at least in the latest data, somewhere around 3 or fewer months of imports. So there's really no room for anything to go wrong. So it's really a knife-edge kind of baseline scenario where you can think of many ways in which the recovery can be derailed. Even this kind of muted, anemic recovery can be derailed.
Can I add one more point to that issue of knife's edge? In the three fragile countries that we talked about, particularly Sri Lanka, Pakistan, but also to the extent of Bangladesh, in all three countries, under IMF conditionality, exchange rate controls have been eased to some extent, and exchange rates have weakened substantially, which has also created pass-through risks for inflation and so on. So do you think that allowing this exchange to sort of freely float could run the risk of exchange rates overshooting and then creating like a 1997 type Southeast Asian crisis dynamic where corporate balance sheet gets stressed because they have dollar payables and the exchange rate then starts becoming a bit of a vicious cycle? I've not really seen much concern expressed in that regard. Do you not consider that as a risk, especially since you said that the recovery is on a knife's edge and other things can go wrong? Couldn't they all then manifest into an exchange rate crisis?
Okay, so we haven't done any research on this, but from the literature, it seems that when exchange rate crises happen, you do get this overshoot, and it's a difficult one to manage. And that's the logic for trying to contain it, with a policy action. Over the longer term, I guess what we have seen with exchange rate crisis is that the output losses, at least in these Laban Valencia type of exchange rate crises, that don't come with financial system crisis, or government debt crisis, those are fewer output losses over the longer term than the crises that are multiple. So where you've got the financial system involved, where you've got the government involved. But yeah, I would concur on your instinct there, but we haven't done any particular research on it.
Right, but just from that instinct perspective, I guess one could argue that Bangladesh is slightly less fragile than Sri Lanka and Pakistan because there's not much of an element of foreign currency debt, especially in the commercial market, which unfortunately in the case of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, there is substantial and there's all these restructuring needs. So related to this, Franziska, you have several times already mentioned the role of government in South Asia and the fact that high investment tends to be driven by impetus from the government. So let's talk about the fiscal situation. How much of a hit did this region take during the pandemic? And with all these financial crises going on, where do we stand with respect to the fiscal situation in the region?
Yeah, so just like the region is a bright spot, the outlier in the global economy, it's also an outlier on the fiscal challenges. It's the region with the highest government debt levels of all regions, 86% of GDP on average. That compares with an emerging market and developing average of 60% of GDP. So it's really well above. And it's not just a few big countries. It's almost all of them, with the exception of Bangladesh and Nepal. All the others have debt levels above the emerging market and developing economy average. And even in Bangladesh, by the latest RIO projections, about a quarter of revenues are going to be spent on interest spending. So maybe the debt level is not high, but it's expensive. That's one aspect of the fiscal challenge in the region. The other aspect is revenue ratios. It's extraordinary how low they are. Every single country in the region, other than Bhutan, has a lower revenue to GDP ratio than the emerging market and developing economy average. In Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, on the order of 8% of GDP. In India, it's below 20% of GDP. It's in Pakistan, it's around 12% of GDP. Compared with the emerging market developing economy averages of almost 30% of GDP. They are way below. And with this kind of low revenue ratio, it's hard to run an efficient government. It's very difficult to finance public investment. It's very difficult to finance all the other things that governments should be financing. So that is a cross-cutting concern. And in some countries, they're already in debt default. And in a way, it's not a surprise because we actually assembled a data set of all the debt defaults we could find, 170 plus since 1979. And you can see that 2/3 of them happened in countries like this, in countries that had above median government debt ratios. And they happened at times like this as well, which is 2/3 of them happened either in the year that the US monetary policy rate tightening ended, the tightening cycle ended, or the year afterwards. In fact, we estimate that a 3.5 percentage point increase in the US Fed funds rate, so on the order of what happened since early 2022, raises the probability of default by almost half. So it's no surprise that the countries that have high debt are defaulting now. This is the time when the largest number of emerging markets is in debt distress since 2000, when our data series starts, basically. That particular data series starts.
And what about the non-crisis, but also characterized by high debt, which is India, which we've seen in the pandemic years, debt GDP ratio rise substantially as well. You were mentioning interest expenditure being a big chunk of total spending of the government of Bangladesh. I believe that's the same situation in India.
Yes, this is. So more than 90% of India's government debt is domestic, to domestic creditors. And that is one way of reducing the probability of debt default. So what we've done is we've put together a sample of all the government debt booms since 1980 in 64 plus emerging markets and developing economies. And we have checked what happens when these booms end. How do they end? In the year of the boom turning, government debt beginning to turn, or the year afterwards? It turns out debt defaults are very rare. Only, well, that's below 10% in either case. But debt defaults on a domestically driven boom are even rarer. The probability of a government debt boom that's domestically financed ending in default is only 2%. So that's 1/3 of the probability of an externally driven debt boom. So that is a way, financing domestically is a way of avoiding debt default. The problem is the cost that comes with it.
That's right.
And that's we split our sample into countries with above median and below median government domestic shares of government debt. And you find significantly that interest rates are a percentage point higher, effective interest rates on government debt, and that'll trickle through the whole economy. Maturities are 2 years lower. And what's perhaps most pernicious is that the share of bank lending to governments is 6 percentage point higher and to private sector 6 percentage point lower. So there's a clear sense of the government borrowing pushing out the private sector and raising borrowing costs for everyone, for the whole private sector. And that's exactly what's happening in South Asia too. South Asia, you also see that interest spending is more than a percentage point higher. The effective interest rates on governments is more than a percentage point higher than in the average emerging market of the developing economy. The debt maturities are more than 2 years lower than in the average. And the share of bank credit to governments is also higher than elsewhere. And that, of course, means that the private sector is lower than elsewhere. So there is a real cost to this, which is borne by the private sector to reduce the probability of default of the public sector.
Franziska, there are many structural reasons why countries run large deficits. You've already touched upon a few of them. Having a very low revenue base sort of necessitates some degree of deficit spending. In some cases, the private sector is not large enough, and the government is sort of forced to carry out a lot of things. In ideal cases, you would like the private sector to do. But I just want to ask you your view on the cyclical aspect, which is in the last 3 years, we were faced with an extraordinary shock. And whether it's the US or India, everybody saw need for large public sector spending and increase in debt ratios. I mean, you're sitting at the World Bank. I mean, is there some thinking that perhaps there should have been more grant financing for afflicted countries around the world so that the debt situation didn't have to worsen just because they had to spend a lot of money during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. I think for a lot of countries, especially low-income countries, they would have been better off with grants, especially now that interest rates are rising. But, there are things that countries can do themselves also to reduce the fiscal pressures when you need to use fiscal resources. And take South Asia again. The debt buildup in South Asia has been much larger than the average emerging market and developing economy. So there is something that makes them use fiscal resources much more than the average emerging market and developing economy when everyone is using them. And
so you mean the debt buildup in the last 3 years has been much more in South Asia than the median
since 2019?
Okay,
yeah, since 2019
okay.
Has been larger. Yeah. And we look at this in one specific respect. When we look at what can countries do to contain fiscal pressures, cyclical fiscal pressures, because of course in a recession you should be using fiscal stimulus. It's obvious, no? The question is how much fiscal stimulus to use, and what we looked at then is fiscal rules. What can fiscal rules do to prevent an excessive use of fiscal resources at times of pressure? And it turns out there's a clear difference between countries that have strong fiscal rules and countries that have weak fiscal rules beyond South Asia, just in emerging markets. The debt buildup was significantly larger in countries that had weak fiscal rules than in those that had strong fiscal rules. And that's the debt buildup during the COVID pandemic, when everyone had a debt buildup, and they should have had. But it's been much larger in those with weaker fiscal rules. And the problem with the countries in South Asia is, of course, that all their fiscal rules are weak, but at least by the IMF's definition. The deficit rules are all in the weakest quartile by the IMF's definition, and the debt rules are near the threshold of the weakest quartile. So 4 countries have debt rules, fiscal rules, and it's a great thing, but they're all on the weak end. So they don't give much protection against excessive use of fiscal policy or fiscal stimulus.
Yeah, that's a terrific insight, and I think it's very helpful to those who sort of observe worldwide developments, but it really contextualizes some of the issues that we're seeing in the case of South Asia. I want to stay with India just a little longer. Again, talking in the context of the fiscal situation, what is your sense of the sort of consolidation plans in the near term? Because the other 3 countries that we're talking about mostly, some degree of balance of payment pressure, some degree of conditionality with the IMF. India doesn't have all this. It has to sort of set its own course for fiscal consolidation. Are you seeing any encouraging signs in that direction?
India has actually been quite remarkable, the fiscal consolidation that's currently planned. And the reason I'm saying that is that it's an election year. So we did an analysis of what happens to fiscal positions during elections in this recent South Asia Development Update. And it's par for the course during election in emerging markets as a whole, emerging markets and developing countries as a whole, 150 plus countries. That's just what happens. In election years, fiscal deficits widen statistically significantly. That's the way it is. It's been forever. And they're not unwound. The next year, they're not statistically significantly unbound. So this is a lasting ratcheting up. That's the pattern among emerging markets and developing economies. India breaks this. The budget this year has a considerable consolidation in there, despite the election year. So that's very encouraging.
Okay. Keep our fingers crossed, and hopefully, that continues. I do worry a little bit about weather-related issues and how they can start affecting some degree of economic activity and by extension tax receipts. But I think that in a way leads me to my next issue. So Franziska, I read your October report. There are two terrific chapters there, and I want to sort of touch on those. So there is a chapter on firms in South Asia in the context of energy intensity and productivity. Tell us a bit more about that chapter.
Yeah, so the chapter was motivated by an interest in climate mitigation. But for South Asia, in the end, it doesn't make that much difference if South Asia cuts its GHG emissions because it's a small part of the global picture. But what is very clear is that productivity is among the lowest in emerging markets and developing economies. It's on par with labor productivity, and total factor productivity is on par with that of sub-Saharan Africa. And you see that for labor productivity, you see that also for energy efficiency, another kind of productivity. So what we showed is that South Asia uses twice as much energy for each unit of GDP as the global average. There must be low-hanging fruit to improve productivity and get the gains in terms of air pollution and get the gains in terms of lower import bills and get the gains in terms of growth and get the gains what we show also in terms of job creation. That's what motivated it. And then we looked at how can that be achieved? How can you encourage firms to become more energy efficient? And it turns out that firms are actually quite energy efficient, or they're quite advanced, or they're quite quick in adopting technologies that are quite basic in energy efficiency. This region really stands out in LED lights, for example. 3/4 of firms use LED lights, energy efficient lighting. This is the most basic technology you can have. Where they really lag is in the advanced technologies. So, for example, programmable thermostats. 7% of firms use them, compared to something like 12-ish% for other emerging markets and developing economies. So firms are very good at the basic technologies. They're much less good at the more advanced technologies. And that's the step that is needed now. So why is that? Okay, many reasons, but one of the reasons is that maybe the information doesn't travel quickly enough. And we show that in a very neat experiment that gives a lot of encouragement to policymakers. We give a few firms motors and meters. So these are garment firms in Bangladesh, 500 plus of them. They use sewing machines and they use these very dirty old clutch motors. So what we do is we give them a new servo motor that runs very energy efficiently. And we give them a meter to actually monitor how much they're saving. So they think they're going to save 30% of their energy. And that's how much they're willing to pay for this meter, about 30% of the actual market price. But it turns out when you start metering, they're going to save 80%. So there's really huge energy savings in this for these firms. So in principle, great experiment, would be nice to give everyone motors and meters, and you would get big energy efficiency gains, but that's obviously not feasible. The interesting bit in that experiment is that you don't need to give the motors and meters to many firms. We find that the same share of firms that never got a motor or meter, the ones in the control group, the same share of firms within 3 months are already beginning to adopt that motor and meter.
Demonstration effect.
Demonstration effects. News travels. Firms are efficient. They see a gain somewhere, and news travels. They catch on to it and they adopt it, and it works. So this is a very inspiring experiment. So this is one way where policy can actually prod firms. And then we also do a number of, but other things are difficult to measure. So we rely on literature reviews. Comprehensive literature review. Everything anyone has ever written on the kind of things that make firms adopt energy efficient technologies. And there are two incredibly powerful policies, and they're both types of regulation: command and control and market-based regulation. And they really work. They really encourage energy efficient technology adoption. The problem with them is that command and control type of regulation imposes heavy costs. You usually do see output losses. You see productivity losses. And that's the beauty of market-based regulation. You don't see it. It's a market-based regulation that you see the gains without having the pain.
That is very, very inspiring to hear. Okay. Then you have this other chapter, which is on green jobs, which I don't think is exactly related to the firm level productivity. So talk a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, this is kind of the household equivalent of the firm level chapter, the first one about energy efficiency. And there, the main goal was to find out how will the energy transition affect South Asia. It's going to happen globally. So whether it happens by government fiat or whether it happens by firms just adjusting to global prices, is going to be underway. And what will happen is that you will see polluting industries contract and you will see green industries expand. Now, the question is, how many workers will be affected? It turns out it's about 10% of the workers in that region. 10% of workers precisely speaking, 9% of workers have pollution-intensive jobs. In every country in the region other than India, the number of pollution-intensive workers is more than the number of green workers. And the first question we always get there, what's green, what's pollution-intensive? And there is actually beginning to be a consensus now in the academic literature. The green workers are the ones that have green tasks. These are workers and occupations with some sort of green task. So that can be recycling, that can be a renewable engineer, but that can also be a bicycle repair guy. That can be a forest manager. It's a broad range of occupations. And the pollution-intensive industry jobs are those that are the most common in pollution-intensive industries. So yes, those are the coal miners, but they're also the garment workers. There are also, I forget the examples in agriculture. But there are still 0.2% of the jobs in agriculture are also pollution intensive. I guess the fertilizer, whoever is heavily involved in fertilizer, also pollution intensive. So it's not just agriculture versus non-agriculture. It's much broader, these green and pollution intensive jobs. And what we find is, 9% of workers in the region as a whole will have to move somewhere, or at least a good chunk of them, because they are pollution intensive jobs. And these are specific workers and specific regions. The workers who are pollution intensive are significantly lower skilled, and they're significantly more likely to win informal job. So it's exactly the workers who find it difficult to move. And the green workers and green jobs are significantly better educated, and they're much more likely to be formal. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, they get a wage premium of 7%, a statistically significant wage premium of 7% on top of the higher wages they get anyways, because they're better educated in formal jobs. So the green workers, I keep telling in these university events, I tell all these graduates, go for a green job, there's 7% waiting for you. And it's the pollution-intensive workers that are the ones who struggle most, who will struggle most to find jobs. And it's also the pollution-intensive regions that there are 8 regions around the sub-regions, so subnational groups in the region that are very heavily exposed to pollution-intensive jobs, compared to only 4 regions that are very big on green. So it's these pollution-intensive regions that will really struggle. And there's just one last aspect to our research that we did. Currently, we know how many workers are in which jobs, but we don't know what's going to happen. And as the closest parallel, we looked at past resource booms and resource busts. What happened to regions, subnational regions that had a resource boom and resource bust? And there is actually large literature. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of the coal mines in West Appalachia, and we've heard of them in the UK and Germany. But there's also oil rigs in Brazil, for example. There are large parts of Latin America that are mines opening and closing. And what turns out to be the case there is that the boom gives you temporary employment gains, not earnings, employment gains, because people flood into the region. And the bust gives you lasting employment losses and earnings losses. They last, they stay, and they stay more than a generation. Because that job that is lost by mom and dad, it means lower skilled kids. Lower educated kids, lower income kids. It's really lasting losses for these regions that go through busts. So big challenge for policymakers, big challenge.
And in terms of that, just expanding on that issue of the big challenge for policymakers, South Asia, of course, has large amount of its energy coming from fossil fuel, particularly coal. Do you see any sort of national strategies in place in terms of not just issue of phasing out coal, because there I think most countries have made some long-term, net zero commitments and so on, but those are in the 2060s and so on. I'm just talking about the near term, dealing with coal phase out or dealing with coal sector jobs. Are we seeing any encouraging developments at all?
Maybe the private sector is the more exciting part there. Through all these countries that I visited, there is a real hype around renewable energy. There is a really broad-based interest in renewable energy from investors, from households, from firms. Everywhere there is this keenness on renewable energy, and for several reasons. One is that in some cases it's even cheaper than the grid energy. In some cases, much more reliable, because the grid is so unreliable. It's a way for people to get access to energy that don't have access to the grid. In that sense, it is full of opportunities and lots of people who are looking for them. The other thing that's encouraging, when you look at the number of jobs in renewable industries, the number of renewable industry jobs in India is almost on par with those in the US or in Europe. The only country that's really well ahead, like orders of magnitude ahead, is China. They have much more. But the interest or the size of the renewable industry, at least measured by the number of jobs, in India is just as much as in the big advanced economies. That is very encouraging. It's a hot new industry.
It sure is. Okay, related to that, I want to just float a thought that I have with you, and I want to hear your reaction to that. So recently, I've seen quite a few articles, Economist, Financial Times, sort of criticizing India for becoming progressively protectionist, and particularly in the context of green transition. That the cheapest green energy materials come from China, but now there are trade barriers, and India is sort of using industrial policy to create its own green infrastructure and green manufacturing. I personally don't have a problem with that, because if two of the largest countries in the world, are using their own resources to subsidize green transition, it's great for the rest of the world. We get to buy those things for cheap because they're creating excess supply. What's your view on that?
I actually share a lot of this. It's very expensive to subsidize. And many of these projects, subsidies will fail to generate any return. So it's good. I mean, it's something that the US and Europe can afford, maybe. It's a different matter for emerging markets. So there aren't many emerging markets that can afford these kinds of subsidies. And I'm not sure it's the best investment for emerging markets to double down on these things rather than just wait for whatever comes out of the US and out of Europe as they're competing with China and just gain whatever's the cheapest out of this. The other aspect to this is also that the region really stands out in its controls of all sorts of flows with the outside world. It has above average import-export controls. It has above average foreign currency controls. It has above average capital inflow and outflow controls. So already the reflex in the region is to control. To now add to that a fiscal dimension is going to be expensive.
Yeah, I fully concur with you. Okay, so we've talked exclusively about South Asia, but Franziska, in your career, you've done many other things, and you've done some broad-based cross-country analysis as well. So earlier this year, for example, you co-authored a publication with Lucia Coglietti on trade-related impediments to growth. So let's talk about this in a broader lens, because this issue is very close to our hearts here in Southeast Asia, because this region is, of course, very open to trade and is feeling the impact of various trade barriers going up around the world. So what was your key takeaway in that paper on trade-related impediments to growth?
So this is the global trade is a real problem for all the countries that are open. And it's not just Southeast Asia. Bangladesh also for years was very open, relies heavily for growth on the export industry, garments in particular. But global trade as a whole has slowed, and I'm sure the culprits are very well known now. A maturing of global supply chain, a pivot of global demand to government away from investment, and trade tensions. So these are sort of the standard three arguments. But even so, and that has reduced the trade elasticity from something like 2 to 1 until about 2010, until the global financial crisis, to something like 1 to 1 ever since then. So every unit of growth will just about give you, of output growth, will give you just about 1 unit of trade growth. And that's very well established. The problem is that going forward, it's the output growth that's also slowing. And that's a different study that tried to really look at all the drivers of growth, all the standard drivers of productivity growth and labor market growth and capital investment, all the usual drivers on growth. And every one you look at points to a slowdown, at least at current trends, unless there's some sort of more productivity miracle, maybe ChatGPT. So output growth is going to slow by about 0.5 percentage point globally. And you will see that in trade growth. So any country that wants to grow on growth is going to have it harder, which means the only way you can grow on external trade growth, on external growth, is by gaining market share. How can you do that? By reducing trade cost. And trade costs, we didn't realize until we started this. I'm sure other people, the experts, realized, but they're huge. The global average is that an internationally traded good costs twice as much as the same good domestically traded. So global trade costs are the tariff equivalent of about 100%. And that's got very little to do with tariffs. Because even in emerging markets, the average tariff is about 8%. Compare that to trade costs with tariff equivalent of 100%. So these tariff costs are in logistics, then shipping. Large parts of it are just logistics and shipping. Uncompetitive movement of goods. And services, of course, have these non-tariff barriers, a lot of regulation. That's the main thing in services. But in goods, it's all about shipping and logistics and border controls and so sand in the wheels and lack of competition. So we've actually done a bunch of regressions and then a thought experiment. What would happen if a country in the worst quartile on shipping, logistics, and border restrictions moved into the best quartile? Improved all its conditions. So these things would improve as much as between the lowest and the worst and the best quartile. And that could halve global trade costs or trade costs in that country. That's a very big experiment because that basically takes something like Sierra Leone to a Poland. But there could be big gains from improvements. That's sort of the bottom line.
Right. But we're not really seeing that, are we?
Very difficult to do. So there are examples, for example, in West Africa. There have been big examples on digitizing borders. Actually, in Guatemala as well. The idea was to get rid of all these border requirements, collapse them into a single point where you submit all the documents, and then you share them across the border. And in both Africa and Latin America, Central America, you have seen big improvements then in volume, number of journeys, I guess the number of journeys and volume of journeys, or volume of goods that cross the border.
See, this is the beauty of doing cross-country research and taking insights from Latin America and then trying to see its implications for South Asia. Franziska, such a pleasure to have you on this chat. The work that you do is deep and broad-based. I mean, I don't think we can do justice to that in a 30, 40-minute conversation, but I think you've given us enough flavor to sort of, pique the interest of our listeners, and hopefully some of them will go to the World Bank page and check out some of your very valuable research work. So again, thank you very much for your time and insights.
Thank you so much, Temo. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Great to have you too. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 113 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.